The following audio recording has been designed for learning purposes only. Do not share, distribute, or provide any type of copies, or this audio lesson will not be made available to you. Good luck with today's lesson.
So we're going to move on to chapter 16. And talk about industrial America. I think I'm going to start out talking about actually some of the industries that affected the United States. Why don't I just give stacks here and you guys just pass them around. A little bit about the industry that was going on here in Michigan. And then I have a little slideshow that I put together on that. And then I'll talk about other specific things relating to the chapter. So there's a number of important industries that were developed here in Michigan in the mid-19th century, the mid to late 19th century, that had an important effect for the whole country as well as the world. For instance, the iron mining as well as the copper mining here in Michigan. Copper was especially significant because and it's the first major finds of copper in the United States were here in Michigan in the mid-19th century. Before that, copper had to be imported from England. And of course, that was expensive to do because of the great cost of shipping it across the ocean. Copper mining is one of the important industries, and which became possible to mine in such a very northwesterly location as Michigan's Upper Peninsula, because it's so far removed from major industries that were developing here in the United States. And yet, because of the access first and foremost initially to the Great Lakes, because it was actually before the railroads even went to that northern area of the country, that then allowed the copper to be shipped out down through the Great Lakes down to places where the copper could be smelted in Detroit, which was quite extraordinary, that you would ship copper, huge chunks of raw copper, hundreds and hundreds of miles to places like Detroit or to Buffalo, New York, to be smelted. Yeah?
Actually, I have a piece of copper from the Marquette area.
Yeah. Have any of you been to the Upper Peninsula? So a few of you. Yeah, if you go to the far northwestern part of the Upper Peninsula, it's called the Copper Country. That's a common term that's used for the Keweenaw Peninsula. And so, but it was a major industry. And actually, one of the towns, Calumet, in the very far northern part, was on the list to become, was considered to become the state capital. It made no sense, really, even though it was an extremely large city. Over 50,000 people lived there in the mid-19th century. But the problem was that, actually, let's see, when Lansing, yeah, about 1865, 1870, something like 50,000 people lived there. But it made no sense because it was so distant from where the major population was that it did not, fortunately, did not become the new state capital. Do you know what the state capital was before Lansing? I learned in a previous history class. It was Detroit. And yeah, good. It was Detroit. And the reason why it was moved from Detroit was because of the War of 1812. There were concerns that perhaps if we ever went to war with Britain or Canada, that Detroit, of course, during the War of 1812, had been invaded when we were still a territory by the British. And therefore, it was too vulnerable being on an international border. And therefore, it needed to be removed to a more distant place in the case of attack, so that the state legislature would have an opportunity to protect itself or to flee if it were necessary. It seems rather odd today in the 21st century, but it was a legitimate concern in the 19th century. So I'll just have to just give me 1 second here. I have a lot of slideshows. Here we go. And it's okay. I've just reorganized all my files, so I'm actually not as familiar. I moved them all, so give me 1 second. Okay, here we go. I've created a few different albums and files, and they all have the same names. It looks confusing. All right. So this, actually, I just thought about it. I think I have a piece of copper in my office. So either I'll run up later today or I'll bring it down on Thursday for you guys to see it. So you reminded me of that when you said you had a piece. Yeah?
I just have a question. These vocabulary sheets, are these like study guides for the
Oh,
test?
sure. Yeah, it's a study guide, and plus you get credit for it. So I will collect some of them. I'll ask for 10 of them out of the 14 over the course of the semester. And it's like a test grade when they get all added up. So, and if you end up missing one, you can always turn in an extra one on the last day of class that's completed. But they have to be completed, okay? So if you start leaving them blank, I just start deducting 1 point for each one. Okay? Because it's really just important to force you to study. So, yeah.
So if you just studied these sheets, would you be okay?
You should definitely be good. I mean, yeah, as long as you come to class and you're paying attention, you should try to keep them out when I'm talking, because I tend to go through every one of those points. So sometimes I have extra things, like sometimes I'll have like special little talks like on today that's kind of really expanding on industry. So that's why definitely good to be here. Yeah. Yeah.
What day is that test?
Yeah, we got to see still. I mean, this chapter 16. So I'll be able to tell you for sure on Thursday, yeah, how we're doing. Yeah, but I was hoping for it to be next week, but it might not be for another 2 weeks. I don't know. We'll see. I know you want it longer. Yeah, I understand. Yeah, yeah. Hey, sorry.
I wonder if you can write the definitions on another sheet of paper and turn it in.
You can always, that's a great question, Nathan. So on the vocabulary, Nathan wanted to know, is that if you write them on a different sheet of paper, can you turn it in? It's fine. I tried to leave you enough room, but I know it's still not a lot of room. You can, but you have to stay in the same order as the sheets and then staple it together. Okay, that's all. Yeah, sure, of course. Good. There you go. Okay, thanks. All right, so this huge piece of copper that we're staring at here on the screen, it's called the Ontonagon boulder. And probably none of you have ever heard of it, but it's actually considered to be a national treasure. It's a massive piece of copper about the size of this table. And it was something of legend going back hundreds of years, in which Native Americans most likely had some type of ceremonies that it was sitting in the river. There were burn marks on it when it was taken by, brought out of the forest and where it was sitting in the river up near Ontonagon, Michigan in the 19th century. It was a Detroit businessman who actually bought it. And there were burn marks on it. There had been actually an exploration in the early 19th century in which Territorial Governor Cass, who I talked about previously because he was the U.S. Senator who supported government's hands-off approach to the whole slave question, if you recall. So, but anyway, it was eventually purchased and brought out of the wilderness by a Detroit businessman. It was a huge effort. They had to put rail tracks and have a cart. They had to float it out first on a barge, and then they had to put it on rail tracks and have a cart and have men push this cart through the forest over rail tracks to get it to Lake Superior, where then it was put on a ship. And when the ship stopped in Copper Harbor, which is at the very tip of the Keweenaw Peninsula, the most northerly part of Michigan, it was confiscated by the federal government. This is in the mid-19th century at the time of the copper boom. And actually this, at the time of the copper rush in the mid-19th century was actually in the 1840s, was the first mineral rush in the United States. Everybody, when you're a kid, learns about the 49ers in California and the gold rush in California. But actually, just a few years before the gold rush, there was the copper rush. And so anyway, many of those prospectors who were here in Michigan end up going out west later on, a few years later, to try to make their fortune in gold when they didn't make their fortune in copper. It's difficult to make your fortune in copper because of the difficulty of extracting it. The majority of it is embedded in rock deep in the ground, whereas in copper, in gold, it can be extracted often through panning gold, and you can still make a fortune, or it's just in the sandy hills, whereas copper is a whole different story. You often have to invest millions of dollars in order to get it out. So you have to have a lot of backing and a lot of manpower to do that, a lot of machinery to do that as well. So anyway, but copper that was found in Michigan was in nearly its pure state, meaning that it didn't really have to go through any type of processing. Basically, the main thing was to get any other forms of minerals that were attached to it off of it, and then it could be used. It was it was really considered to be 99% pure. And so you should probably write that down, that Michigan copper was 99% pure, and that made it extremely a good grade of copper, and very desirable. And really just at a time as the Industrial Revolution is starting to ramp up in the mid-19th century. The treaty, you have Indian treaties that are made with the Chippewa Indians in the far northwest of Michigan. This is Douglas Houghton, who actually made the initial discovery of Michigan copper. Certainly there was a lot of talk going back many decades about copper, but nobody really could figure out where it was in the Upper Peninsula. And it was Douglas Houghton who actually found where the deposits were. Like, people knew of the Ontonagon boulder, and they knew like you could find pieces of copper. Like the Ontonagon boulder is a piece of float copper. All that means is it's a piece of solid copper, solid fissure copper. Fissure copper is the solid masses of copper that hundreds of millions of years ago during the Earth's formations, or even earlier than that maybe, molten copper was pushed up through, or after the Earth's formation, molten copper is pushed up through extinct volcanoes, and it fills the vents and rock of the area. And Douglas Houghton realized that the copper wasn't from around where Ontonagon is, but further north, about 40, 50 miles, although there's a major vein of copper that does run down through the peninsula. And so it's his discoveries that are significant. But the problem was in the mid-19th century, in the early 1840s, even though Michigan became a state in 1837, the federal government hadn't made a treaty with the native peoples in about the western third or so, the western half of the Upper Peninsula. And so technically no white people could go to that part of Michigan until the treaty was made. I may have mentioned in this class before that historically the federal government always recognized that the Indian tribes owned the land, but they didn't necessarily recognize that they had the right to continue to own the land. And so, and that's a good example in Michigan, is that they get the title away from the Indians in the early 1840s through the Treaty of La Pointe. And here we see actually a map denoting the Keweenaw Peninsula, and it's through the spine. It's basically through the center of the peninsula is where the major copper deposits are. So, and that's just a copy of the Treaty of La Pointe, which goes into effect in 1843. And then it leads to the copper rush. This is a photograph I took a few years ago when I was in Copper Harbor. And what would have happened is that prospectors would have come by ship up to Copper Harbor. The ships would have docked here in the harbor. And then the prospectors were said to rush into the forest in the next few years, 1844, 45, 46. There was large numbers of young men going to seek their fortune in this very northerly part of the country. And quickly finding out that it was really difficult to extract copper out of the ground. You start to see wealthy businessmen from eastern cities, especially Boston, Boston being one of the oldest cities in America and the United States. It's a great deal of wealth made there in the previous century, going back to the 18th century even. And so you have these old established families with money that were investing to establish copper countries here to make even more money. And they found companies like C&H, Calumet and Hecla Mining Company, and the Quincy Mining Company. And so those are two of the major copper companies in the country in the late 19th century and the early 20th century. And you could write that down too. Calumet, Hecla, C-A-L-U-M-E-T, and Hecla, H-E-C-L-A, was one of the major copper mining companies, and then Quincy, Q-U-I-N-C-E-Y. Quincy, because referring to Quincy, Massachusetts, and a lot of times you'll find names from the east associated and used in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, in this part of the Upper Peninsula. So the earliest copper mines were established just to extract that fissure copper that had filled these ancient volcano vents, and it was the closest to the surface. And we see a picture here of, this is the Cliff Mine. It was one of the earliest, and it actually was successful, but the problem was that it only operated for about 20 years. And by about the time of the Civil War in 1861, it was pretty much running out of copper to extract. And mining companies realized that if they wanted to continue to extract copper, that they had to be more sophisticated and go deeper and deeper into the earth. And, but fortunately, of course, because this is the time of the Industrial Revolution, you have all kinds of new machinery that's being invented that will help to actually do that. And so, one of the forms of the copper that's being mined down deep in the earth is a conglomerate, and this is an example of conglomerate rock that has just tiny little pieces of copper embedded in this rock. And so it has to be crushed. And now early on, as they're doing that, they actually would have, they did have a steam hammer, which was pretty good, better than having men, with hammers crushing the rock individually. But they were still taking chunks of rock, putting it so that the steam hammer, a big hammer that was powered by a steam engine, could crush it. It's still very labor intensive, but not as labor intensive as a man with a sledgehammer crushing the rock. So as time goes on, so that's an example in the mid-19th century how there's machinery to actually start doing more and more of the labor that previously humans would have done. On the right there is actually another example of float copper, just like the Ontonagon boulder. Ontonagon boulder is exceptional because it's so large. So initially, as they start digging into the rock, blasting into the rock, going down into the earth, it's just one or two shafts. And so they can climb down on ladders. And actually, you do see a ladder here that was being used. But you also see a very, I don't know, unusual situation here. And what the guys are doing is this is actually an early form of an elevator. And it's almost like if you play a video game where there's contraptions that go up and down and you have to jump like in Mario Brothers or something. And it's called a man bob. And it's a very early form of elevator that was used in the mines. And what you would do is you would move from platform to platform as they passed each other. And that's how you get back up to the top. And that contraption, this man bob, was powered by a steam engine. I actually just saw online that there's early 19th century elevator in Eastern Europe that's kind of like that. It's not that bad. It's actually just an open car where as it passes, you step into it. And most of them have been banned now in Europe because they're extremely dangerous. Because obviously, if you make a mistake or trip and it's going down, you'll get crushed. So there was no early on. There was no engines to power the carts, the copper ore carts that would. Actually, for most of the time, there was no power to take the copper out, so it was pushed by men. Eventually, what you find is that there was power, certainly in the 20th century, where they would have some type of small, maybe electric engine that worked down in the mine. But the guys who pushed these carts were called, or trams, were called trammers. And it was huge. It was really excruciating, back-breaking work to be a trammer. That was one of the worst jobs that you could do because all you did all day long was push these heavy carts full of rock and copper ore through the mine so that then it could be brought up out of the lower levels, the shafts. So that's just a stock certificate for Calumet Hecla Mining Company. This is its president for about 50 years, Alexander Agassiz, who made the company so successful. They consistently pay dividends to their stockholders, and that's a significant aspect of business in the 19th century, that it's recognized, corporations are recognized as an entity, much like a person is, except for because it has the legal rights, and similar to an individual person would have. A corporation has these rights under the law of the United States. And so how many of you were able to buy a book now somewhere? Have any of you been able to find it online? Only one of you. Okay. I was going to say, in your book, if you have Chapter 16, which you still don't, remember they are on reserve in the library, so you can go start looking at the chapters and check it out for a few hours. But Chapter 16 does talk about how corporations are legal entities just like a person, and so but in general the stockholders are not responsible. They're not liable under law for something bad that the corporation would do. So this is an image of Calumet Hecla's mining operations, numerous buildings that deal with the management of it, so various, as well as machine shops that have to make and repair tools that are being used. The mine shaft itself covered over, so basically the hole in the ground where they're going down to extract copper is underneath this building here. There would be offices for the management, and that's an important aspect of growing corporations in the 19th century is that you go from the 18th century where, for the most part, especially here in the United States, very small companies, if you even have them. For the most part, industry in the United States in the 18th century and the early 19th century is largely just home industry, people making things and selling them, or just people being farmers, of course, and then selling their produce. But with the Industrial Revolution, and as it ramps up in the 19th century, you see companies becoming larger and larger, doing business internationally, and needing a management level, a mid-management level. And that's really what's creating the middle class. And essentially the way that we live today, most people in the United States today are middle class. And this middle class society, which really had never existed in any large number previously to the Industrial Revolution, will become standard here in the United States and Europe because of that. So Payne Weber and Company was a Boston company, and this is actually their abandoned building that's still sitting there in Calumet, Michigan. The mines closed decades ago. Unfortunately, it got too expensive to extract copper from deep in the ground. Some of these shafts were going down deeper and deeper. I'll show you one mine where it was over a mile deep by the time it closed. It became too expensive to operate, and they eventually closed. And the copper prices as well dropped by the early part of the 20th century, which made it too expensive for these older mines to operate as new deposits were found other places in the country as well as around the world where American business could buy from other places cheaper. If you've ever been to the Greenfield Village out in Dearborn, one of the locomotives that's used to pull tourists around is actually a locomotive that was used by the Calumet and Hecla Mining Company, and it's been restored by the Henry Ford Museum. And actually it's under restoration right now. It's been used for a number of years, and it's in for a kind of a rebuild now after many years of operation at the museum. So the Quincy mine is actually the mine, Quincy mine shaft number 2. This is a picture of the operations at Quincy overlooking Houghton, Michigan, which is across the water there. This is the shaft house number 6. It was known as the House of Seven Gables. And then Quincy number 2 that sat nearby, which is still there. But it, in the early part of the 20th century, was the deepest mine in the world. It was over a mile deep down into the earth. And here's how it looks today. It's actually part of one of the national parks, part of the Keweenaw National Historical Park. And so you can go visit it. You can actually take a specially built tram. You can't go down like the miners did, but you can actually take a special tram that's been built now in the last about 20 years and go down the side of the hill and then go into an adit or an adit, which is a tunnel that's been bored into the side of the hill and to go into one of the lower shafts. And so it's an interesting experience to get to see how miners live, which is pretty tough work. You'd spend 10 to 12 hours a day down deep in the earth doing this back-breaking work. The deeper you get, it would actually get warmer, and so and it's dark all the time. So which meant that you could go in the winter, you could go to work when it's dark, and you would come home when it's dark. You'd never see the light of day. Quincy shaft house, the modern shaft house that was built in the early 20th century that we see here, was significant because it was automated. It would bring the ore from deep in the earth. It would dump it into this section right here of the building, and it had a series of grinders that would grind up the rock and the copper ore, and automatically, without any humans having to deal with it. And then there would be tram cars underneath and it would dump the ground up pulverized rock and ore into it, into these cars, and then it would be on a rail track, and it would be sent down the hill to a smelting facility where they would melt the ore. They would separate as much rock from the ore as possible on a huge piece of machinery called a bubbler that was about the size of this room. It was a giant disc that would rotate, and water would flow over it, much like a mining pan, like if you were mining for gold, like a prospector might have, but on a huge industrial scale. And then what was left could be put into the smelters, and the copper extracted, and the other minerals could be extracted, taken, skimmed off. And so it was very modern operation by the early part of the 20th century. Actually, there was, in this building, which still exists, the Quincy Mining Company purchased the largest steam hoist ever built in the world up until that time. And it's still housed in this building here at the Quincy site. So, and here's a diagram of how the grinder worked. Here's a model that a graduate student built. I went to a conference up there a few years ago showing how the shafts were dug into the ground.
You know, like the diagram?
Oh, sure. Yeah, this was a book from I found when I was up there that was talking about how that worked. And so ore is like dropped down, ground up somehow in here, and then could be extracted. And here's the hoist. And this is a giant barrel in which the metal cord, which would be attached to either cars that brought the men up from the mine or brought them down into the mine, or could be attached to big ore cars that would pull the ore out of the mine, or watering cars, because even though steam engines had been invented in the early 1700s to pump water out of mines, it was not effective for this mine because the mine was so deep that they had to revert to physically taking water out. And so they would plunge huge, almost like buckets, but they looked like railroad cars. And so there's giant box-like structures that would be hooked to the metal roping, brought down into the mine and filled up that had been filling up with water, and then pull these cars out and dump them. So, and this is the machine that operated that whole mine. And it was all powered by steam power, even though it was the early 20th century. So, and so here's men whose lives depended on the operator who was operating that huge hoist. And they'd be brought down. Actually, if we go back and take a look at this hoist, I can show you here. The guy who ran this giant piece of machinery, he sat up here on a chair. And these two wheels actually told him, because there was always one car going down into the mine and one car coming up. And it might be filled with a car with water, it might be filled with ore, it might be have men on it. And so he could not be distracted because people's lives depended on him. So he would sit up here away from the commotion down below him and always be watching carefully, slowly, making the machine work so that as the cars were going up and down, he would know what level they were. And then there was a system of bells that would ring. So he'd be telling the people down below that he's ready to move and stay back. So and then I mentioned that they could smelt the ore right there near the site and just go down the hill. And this is actually the last remaining 19th century copper smelting facility in the United States. And it's barely survived. Actually, about 20 years ago when I was in graduate school, I went up and took some pictures of it when it was all collapsing. Like all this new metal that you see here, that was basically all caved in. There was no roofs on many of these buildings. Actually, here you can see there's different colors from the bricks. There's been a lot of work done to preserve these buildings because everything was literally caving in the 1990s. And fortunately, because it's part of the national park, I'm not quite sure that it might be owned by the federal government now. 20 years ago it wasn't. The federal government has been very wary about buying a lot of sites, as you can imagine, because of the huge costs that it incurs to fix them up and then to maintain them. But there was somehow money available to do this restoration work so that it didn't completely collapse and we would lose this important part of America's industrial history. And it's right here in our state, but what's so unfortunate is that because most of the population lives in the Lower Peninsula and it's so far, you can drive to New York City probably quicker than you can drive to Houghton and Hancock. It's about 600 miles from where we are, so it's a long drive. So once the copper would be smelted, it would be formed into either ingots, as we see here, copper ingots, or sometimes what was called copper cakes. And copper cakes were just large slabs of copper, sort of like the tabletops of your desks here. And they would be stacked on board ships and then sent off to whatever manufacturer, whatever industry had purchased them. And of course, there was the telephone industry, the electrical industry, all kinds of major companies that are forming at the time that needed copper would be buying it from here in Michigan. And not necessarily just American companies. Because of the international trade, it could mean that you could be shipping this copper any place around the world. Because the Great Lakes, of course, connecting to both rail systems here in the Americas and then to shipping lanes around the globe. This is an image of a miner in the early part of the 20th century using a modern drill, because you have to drill into the rock and then you would have to put dynamite and blast. And this mine, the one-man drill, was nicknamed the Widowmaker because miners didn't like it. Before about 1913, the miners worked in pairs because they had bigger drills. But this new invention allowed only one miner to do the work that previously two miners had done. Of course, saving costs, something that corporations always then and now want to do because labor is the major cost in business operations. But it was much more dangerous because if you're just one guy working in a remote part of the mine, long hours, and there's an accident, it might not be till the end of your shift that someone realizes that you haven't shown up to go back up to the surface. And by that time, of course, you could be dead, where the idea was that if two guys were working together, that hopefully one would be able to run and get help if something went wrong. And there's actually a terrible long drawn-out strike in 1913, one of the worst labor strikes in the country of the early part of the 20th century, in which the mines shut down. The men were furious over the use of these one-man drills. This is actually a march that was held by the children of the miners in 1913. Things got so bad that the National Guard was called out in order to protect the mining property. And the mine owners were obviously not happy that they were losing money. The mines weren't operating. And by December of 1913, the mine strike had been going on now for several months. There was a party held in this building. This this was called the Italian Hall for the children of striking miners. And it's believed, all recent research points that there was a man who worked for the management of Calumet Hecla Mining Company who came in and yelled fire with the intention of creating havoc and scaring everybody who was in the hall. There was only one way out, one way in and one way out, through a doorway, this doorway right here. And this was on Christmas Eve, December the 24th. In the afternoon, there was this party. He yells fire. People begin to panic. Fire, of course, is very common in the 19th century and early 20th century, with everything operating on coal or wood, having open flames for your stoves as well as your furnaces. It's easy for sparks to catch things on fire. So people panic. Everyone starts rushing for the door, and it's mostly young children and their mothers. And people begin to trip and fall. And as they fall, people can't get out. And people start to fall on top of each other. And you have over 70 people dead, mostly children. And so it's a horrible, horrible tragedy. And it ends up creating so much turmoil within the community that even though the strike continues for a few more months, more and more people begin to move away. And they don't want to have anything to do with the strike. They don't want to live there anymore because so many families have been affected by this. I actually know a lady who used to work with my mom, and her aunt actually was at this party in 1913, but luckily survived. So this is a photograph of the funerals. Often there were these there were funerals held all together on the same day, and then there was a mass grave where the caskets were all buried in Lakeview Cemetery outside of Calumet. So it's really seen as a horrible national tragedy. But probably one of the worst examples of a labor strike gone bad in the 20th century, in which you have the owners of the mines really only concerned about the operations, not necessarily concerned about their workers, and how they sent somebody in to purposely disrupt a party that was attended by mostly innocent, just by women and children. So, but it did have the effect that they wanted. I don't think they envisioned that it would kill anybody when they planned it. I think it was probably more of something to scare people, but it had terrible consequences. And we still don't know to this day exactly what happened and who was really at fault. But there's been some really interesting articles that have been written about it and really in-depth research. So if you've never heard of this tragedy of the copper mining strike of 1913, it's a pretty sad event in labor history in this country. All right. So unfortunately, the hall where it took place was torn down by its owners about 30 years ago, and which is really unfortunate because it was an important part of the history of the area. All right. So I'll continue on with this this idea of industry in the United States. And certainly it wouldn't have been possible to operate these huge industrial complexes that were being built around the country had it not been for the huge influx of labor from Europe, of cheap labor, unskilled labor from Europe. And by the late 19th century, unskilled labor that's coming from primarily Southern and Eastern Europe. And so make sure you remember that and write it down, that the vast majority of immigrants in the decades after the Civil War are not coming from Western Europe, as they had done previously to the Civil War, but they're coming from Eastern Europe. They're coming from places like Italy, Russia as well, Eastern European nations, which are in terrible economic shape, and Southern European nations, which are in terrible economic shape. So if any of you have Italian backgrounds or Russian backgrounds, it's a good chance that your ancestors came in the decades, the late 19th century and the early 20th century, in order to escape the poverty that was going on, as well as in Eastern Europe, in places like Russia, the horrible discrimination that was going on against the Russian Jewish people there. And it was terrible. There was something called pogroms, in which the Tsar's troops would go out and attack Russian Jewish villages and kill people and terrorize people, and they would be forced to flee. This is just a photograph, a colorized photograph taken in the early 20th century. While color technology of film is really in its infancy, it does exist in the early 20th century, but most people, it really wasn't necessarily available to the public. It's really only made on a small scale. And so what you would do if you wanted a color photograph, say you had your picture taken, there were actually people that were hired. Photographic companies had whole departments where they would often hire young women, and they would literally take little tiny paintbrushes and paint a wash of color over the black and white photographs. And that's actually something that was done until the early 1960s. So, coal is another important part of the industrializing of America. The major centers of the coal industry in this country were West Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Kentucky, still important areas of extracting coal, although a lot of coal does come from the northern plains as well today. But because America ran on steam power, it was necessary to fuel the steam engines, heating the water to produce the steam that then turned the machinery. So, forests supplied the wood that was necessary to build the growing towns and cities. And so the east of the Mississippi River was largely forests. And it's during this time period that the vast majority of those forests were cut down in the United States in order to build cities like Detroit and Chicago and Cleveland and all the new emerging industrial centers to house the workers. And I chose this photograph just because I'd never seen it before, and I thought it was so funny and unusual that here you have, they started cutting into this giant tree, and one of the workers just decided to lay in there while they took the picture. You can see the saw, the two-man saw that would have been used to do the labor in the 19th century. Automated saws don't come about until the 20th century. So all this work is going on with really hard physical labor. And I can talk a little bit about the lumbering camps if we have time later today. Out west, gold and silver is being discovered in these remote areas of the West. I mentioned the Comstock lode the other day. Certainly remember this Comstock lode, $400 million of silver extracted in Virginia City, Nevada in the late 19th century, making its owners extremely wealthy. But unfortunately, most of the miners who worked for these corporations are only making, or most of the workers are only making small sums of money. They're just doing the back-breaking work. If you're going to have a decent living for yourself and your family, if you worked for a company, then if you had a little bit of an education, you could work in the office. And then those are the people that are making a better wage and are entering the middle class. So I've already mentioned copper, and Montana and Arizona will then become the copper centers as time goes on. This photograph, again, though, is taken here in Michigan. The textile industry is important. It's really a very early example of industrialization in the United States. You actually see the first operations going back to late 1700s. But the textile industry becomes more and more important as time goes on, as we are able to, as American inventors are able to figure out exactly how to build machines that are necessary, such as carding machines, spinning machines, weaving machines that are all automated. The British inventors had come up with this in the 18th century, and American inventors essentially steal that technology in the late 18th and the early 19th centuries, and America becomes a major producer of cloth then in the 19th century. But the days were long. Workers, for the most part, the unskilled workers, as is always the case, make very low wages. Men are always the top paid workers historically, and certainly true in the 19th century. Women always made less than men historically, and because child labor was legal in the 19th century, children always made less than women. And children were especially desired to work in the textile industries, which begins largely in the northeast in Rhode Island. Is really the center of the textile industry. It will move in the decades after the Civil War to many companies to the deep south. And I think this has come up before, where then they would build the factories right near the cotton fields so that you wouldn't have to pay the shipping costs, which led to, for a variety of reasons, but by every decade of the 19th century, the price of cloth went down. It became cheaper and cheaper and cheaper over that 100 years. Yeah?
Also, children were at a very higher risk of mortality.
Yeah, it's extremely dangerous for kids. But they liked them in the textile industry because they were small. And they could, if there was a problem, what they could do is they'd say, well, why don't you crawl into some area and see what you can figure out. Not the best of ideas to send a little kid because it was so dangerous crawling in between these huge pieces of machinery, and you could easily get severely injured or killed. So if you notice here, this kid has shoes and this kid doesn't. Shoes are historically very expensive. It's because until systems are invented in the 19th century to mass produce shoes, it's very labor intensive. There's so many pieces to a shoe that when they were being made by hand, it meant it was extremely expensive. And so for poor people, you didn't wear shoes in the warm weather. So we know this photograph was taken sometime in the summer, or spring or summer, or maybe early fall, because the kid's not wearing shoes. And also because it's probably the South, because it's more common in the South for kids not to wear shoes because of the extreme poverty in the South. And you would save your shoes for the inclement weather, when it rained or when it was too cold. There's a lot of political corruption in the 19th century, and this certainly has a profound impact on industry. It generally means that because wealthy business leaders are able to contribute to politicians' campaigns, that politicians are less likely to be interested in bringing about any type of reforms, any type of laws that will hamper or regulate companies, which is in general detrimental to the average person at the time, because the reason for some type of reforms was to protect workers regulation comes about in the 19th century, and very slowly. But there is some regulation in the 19th century, but primarily in the 20th century. And it's really because people, Americans, use their political might, the average Americans, and say, we want protection from the excesses of big business. Big businesses were treating their workers so terribly and was risking the lives of their workers, and yet businesses felt that they had no responsibility to their workers historically. There was no type of workman's compensation in the 19th century. If you were injured on the job in the 19th century, this is what your boss would say: well, it's your own fault. That's too bad, and you're not getting any money from us.
They were also, sometimes they would actually fire you depending on how.
Oh, of course they would fire you. Yeah, because you couldn't work, so they would fire you. If you were lucky, they might send your widow a small amount of money, but that was really not something that they had to do. If you might be lucky if it happened. This idea in which business leaders believe that government should impose no regulation is called laissez-faire. It's a French term. Essentially, let it be. Let the markets take their course, and certainly something that many people believe in even today. Certainly, you guys are probably too young to remember, but 10 years ago when the economy collapsed, there were many politicians and business leaders who thought that the government should not intervene, should not bail out the banks, and just allow the entire system to collapse. That is a very dangerous viewpoint in this time, and fortunately the government didn't do that because it was pretty bad 10 years ago. Worst recession since the Great Depression, and it's often referred to now as the Great Recession. But this was the common belief of the day. Business leaders thought that, that business would thrive without any government interaction. And certainly businesses were able to make huge profits. Huge numbers of millionaires are being made in the late 19th century. And it started with the Civil War. Government contracts could be had to fight the Civil War, and people were able to make huge profits, and you see that trend continue in the last 40 years of the 19th century. Because there was not, there was a tiny little bit of government regulation, but not very much. And so wages were extremely low. Wages really didn't have to rise. Actually, prices are quite high in the late 19th century.
Good luck with today's lesson.